So the gray zone is basically that space that exists between peace and war, legal and illegal.
How does the Philippines balance the economics along with its sovereignty claims or push for taking a stand against China?
The trade policy of the country is not solely dependent on a particular country that will unabashedly use gray zone tactics like economic coercion in order to forward its illegitimate or illegal basis, particularly on the maritime zone.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Now, it's a term that roughly describes the dangerous space in between war and peace in which state and non-state actors engage in coercive activities. The tactics can result in full-blown conflict like what we're seeing in Israel and the Palestinian territories or the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, gray zone warfare is aimed at weakening an adversary over a prolonged period. It's used by China to exert its claims on Taiwan. In the South China Sea, China engages in more overt tactics to permanently change the status quo, like island building and fortification work. But it also deploys other aspects, including economic and psychological war with fake news and propaganda. Muddying transparency in the legal and political spheres are also tools that are employed. And to talk about gray zone warfare both within and outside the military realm, we're joined by Aries Arugay, professor and chairperson of the Department of Political Science of the University of the Philippines-Diliman. Aries, can we get you to start with a brief overview of the range of methods gray zone warfare can encompass?
Well, as you mentioned, it varies along the range of between basically conflict or war and peace. And anything within these two extremes that somehow helps a state to coercively put pressure to smaller and weaker states in order to safeguard its security and other national interests could be categorized under the gray zone or gray zone strategies. So it could involve security, strategic, legal, psychological, political, quasi-diplomatic, and to a certain extent with the advent of social media, even cognitive dimensions.
As we mentioned, the South China Sea incidents are some of the more tangible examples of China's coercion tactics. Ray Powell, director of Sea Light, had this to say about China's maritime gray zone warfare.
So the gray zone is basically that space that exists between peace and war, legal and illegal, things that sort of fuzz the usual distinctions that we're used to making. And so China does things such as swarming vessels together to basically assert their jurisdiction or their sovereignty over a particular feature or a particular area of the water. They can even tie them together in what we call rafts of vessels that basically create something of a floating outpost. They have these encounters with other vessels, they can go all the way from simply swarming them to close encounters, blocking them, bow crossing, even in some extreme cases ramming them, and then of course these uses of non-lethal weapons like the lasers or the water cannons. All of these are things that are somehow meant to stop short of what might invoke, for example, the Philippines' mutual defense treaty with the United States, so that they can say, hey, this was just, this was normal police action in areas under China's jurisdiction, nothing to worry about, nobody was really hurt.
Now, Aries, can you tell us how the Philippines is viewing China's gray zone tactics in the South China Seas, in particular with as it comes across Philippine vessels and Philippine infrastructure?
Well, increasingly, there's recognition, not only among members of the security sector, as well as civilian security agencies like the Coast Guard, but increasingly, gray zone tactics have caught the attention of national-level politicians, including senators, as well as high-level bureaucrats and even cabinet members. And this increasing realization has put into focus this very sinister way of China imposing its interests that somehow undermine core territorial integrity dimensions of Philippine national security that before these politicians would tend to ignore or would tend to not pay attention.
What's caused the shift? How much of it is public opinion and how much of it is political will?
Well, the transparency approach adopted by the relatively new Marcos Jr. administration has somehow put China's gray zone tactics, particularly in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea, to the national agenda. So we not only hear news, we see images, we see fishermen being voluntarily confessing of China's aggression in the West Philippine Sea. Under the previous administration of Rodrigo Duterte, a lot of this were under the radar, or at least the Philippines was only silently protesting it diplomatically. But under this new administration of Marcos, the government and therefore the security sector as well as the public gets to be exposed to a lot of these actions of China. And it doesn't help China's image because China remains the most distrusted major power by the Filipino public, which is quite different in how other Southeast Asian publics view China.
Now, Aries, as you know, Taiwan is the target of much of China's coercive actions. So to understand Taipei's perspective on the South China Sea maneuvers, we spoke to Chi Ting Tsai. He's the Associate Professor of International Law at the National Taiwan University.
We have experienced a very intense military exercise last year in August. And I think for China's, they have a very standard formula or discourse here that is response and action, respond to foreign intervention, what they call foreign interventions. So this kind of the foreign intervention, and they are forced to respond and make a reactions formula, is to incrementally practice their control over their territorial disputes or sovereignty rights claim or any other jurisdiction control claim. And so last year we experienced a very huge change over the status quo in Taiwan Strait, which is median line. And also that I think that even for our contiguous zone, and maybe probably the territorial seas right now is under a very dangerous situations, which might be encroached by their different kinds of the military exercise there. And so I think that from Taiwan's perspective, this kind of the tactics in the South China Sea actually are very identical.
Now, Aries, China's been very clear on its end game with Taiwan. It claims Taiwan is part of its territory. But what's it trying to achieve with the Philippines?
Well, it still upholds its 9, or you could say 10-dash line, and believes that even certain occupied features in the West Philippine Sea that has been given to the Philippines by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016 and is actually in our exclusive economic zone, China continues to relentlessly claim these features or these maritime zones as part of its territory. So in other words, what China insists is that the Philippines' maritime boundaries are not in accordance with what its historical claims are, despite UNCLOS, despite the arbitral award, and therefore China continues to insist that it has sovereignty within the 9-dash line, even if international law has hugely denied these claims. But China, of course, uses its sheer power and reminds the Philippines constantly that its sheer size should be the gauge of territorial claims and not international law.
Now, it also puts the Philippines in somewhat of a quandary. China still is the Philippines' biggest trading partner. So how does the Philippines balance the economics along with its sovereignty claims or push for taking a stand against China?
That's a valid, supposedly somehow dilemma, exposing a dilemma because the previous administration under Duterte wanted more cordial relations with China in order to contribute or to benefit from China's economic largesse. But unfortunately, 6 years of a very accommodationist, and you may even say defeatist policy of the Duterte government towards China has not really contributed economically beyond, for example, trade. And when we filed the case against China in 2012, or at least a little after the Scarborough Shoal incident, we didn't get a lot of trade from China, and yet the Philippines survived. So I think the critical thing here, the trade policy of the country is not solely dependent on a particular country that will unabashedly use gray zone tactics like economic coercion in order to forward its illegitimate or illegal basis, particularly on the maritime zone.
Right, so going back to the South China Sea, Professor Chi-Ting Tsai from the National Taiwan University in Taipei says Taiwan should not discount other less obvious tactics China deploys in the maritime region.
I would say that we should also notice about China's marine scientific research actions in the South China Sea. Because as the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative's analysis, AMTI's analysis, they just, I think they issued last year, that their analysis shows that actually China has a fourfold or even fifthfold of the numbers of their marine scientific research vessels in the South China Sea. They deployed there. And this is also a kind of a low-cost way to raise other claimants' cost to make the enforcement, or not enforcement, but to spend some kinds of the cost to patrol or even have a kind of the conflict, a very small conflict with China, and then China can use that kind of the conflict I think that kind of conflict to make some creeping jurisdiction over there. And so that's why we see that, for example, China has this kind of the marine scientific research conflict with Malaysia and also Vietnam and also Philippines in Bashi Channel. And so I think I would say we've had to pay more attention, right, in recent development of their marine scientific research activities there.
Right, I want to bring it onshore now and I talk about some of the other gray zone tactics that you are seeing in the Philippines. Let's talk about democracy, how China can be using these tactics to undermine Asia's oldest democratic republic. Can you give us an idea of how those subtleties work?
Right. The Philippines has a long experience with democratic rule. And despite of this, we still have political elites who might be construed as only paying lip service with democracy. And for the longest time, the Philippines' foreign aid protocols has always been that foreign aid is laden with democracy or human rights conditionalities. China coming in and filling in some of the gaps, or at least offering an alternative, somehow makes some Filipino political elites not to even pay lip service to democracy anymore. So China's foreign aid actually is chipping away in some of the supposed compliance of the country towards democratic institutions and norms. And we all know that China tends to propagate and promote its mode of governance that somehow is quite appealing to some Filipino voters, the same voters who catapulted Rodrigo Duterte and Ferdinand Marcos Jr. into power. These Filipinos tend to see that democracy, particularly the liberal kind, has failed, and therefore strongman rule, or the rule of a regime that has no opposition, or the opposition should be somehow non-existent at all, somehow is or at least converges with China's model. So I think part of China's gray zone is quite appealing at present, particularly when Philippine democracy itself is being undermined by its own political elites.
And the Philippines' political elites are often populated by the older generation. Here in Taiwan, what we're seeing is the younger generation putting their foot down and really calling for a very clear line between being Taiwanese and Chinese. So that nationalistic fervor. Are you seeing that with the Philippines youth too?
Well, Divya, if you would look at the median age of a Filipino politician, compare that with the median age of the average Filipino, there's a wide gap. Filipino politicians tend to be way older, while the median age of Filipinos is around early 20s. And this makes us still a young population that is quite of a different generation from the political establishment. And in a way, this could somehow be they could be a catalyst for hope, for a change in politics away from traditional patronage and politics that is not intrinsically democratic. However, the Filipino youth is not a monolithic identity, meaning or entity, meaning social class as well as education as well as critical thinking skills quite vary among the youth. And this makes us somehow, the Filipino youth also could be a force to preserve the old order rather than being a catalyst for a new, more democratic, more progressive country.
Right, and you talk about the critical thinking and the education system, and in our previous conversation, you'd mentioned how even that is possibly being infiltrated through gray zone warfare tactics. Can you explain?
Yes, as what Maria Ressa, the Filipino journalist who is the Nobel Peace Laureate, said, the Philippines has been the petri dish for disinformation strategies of various kinds, maybe state-sponsored, external-sponsored. So what the research is saying is that while the Filipino youth is digitally connected and can quite access technology, their susceptibility to fake news and disinformation is quite high. One study said that as many as 7 out of 10 Filipino youth could be victimized by fake news. So this ability of the youth to be able to stand up and critically examine policies, including foreign policy or very pro-Beijing policies, could be undermined if they are increasingly vulnerable to fake news. And we've seen pro-Beijing narratives, for example, and to this point, for example, hundreds of TikTok influencers are being mobilized to somehow tell the Filipino public that we should not anger China, that China is a kind power, and therefore, when we assert our claims on the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea, we are actually provoking war. This defeatist and narrative is being is so prevalent in social media, and the Filipino youth without critical thinking skills could just take this line as it is without even asking the importance of defending Philippine national interests.
And so how much effort is being made both nationally and by groups within Philippines to counter that kind of misinformation or to even address that issue?
There's been civil society-led fact-checking initiatives, but unfortunately, there hasn't been much buy-in from the public. Unlike Taiwan, legislation or policies and institutions to combat fake news are basically non-existent in the Philippines. Quite ironically, the Marcos Jr. administration, he himself acknowledged fake news and disinformation and wanted a media literacy campaign. But all of us who've been studying disinformation for quite some time wants to focus more on the political economy as well as the architecture of disinformation in countries like the Philippines, because a lot of the disinformation may not be state-sponsored, but they're encouraged by political actors. And if you're a politician who benefited from disinformation, you're a Filipino politician, you would not really lift a finger in addressing disinformation when you yourself benefited from it.
Right. And I want to pull back a little bit now and take a look at the macro view, the regional view. We asked Ray Powell about his views on whether ASEAN countries are aligned when it comes to countering China in the South China Sea.
I think that there's thinking among some of the countries that it's just better to keep things quiet. That they feel like they're managing China, that they're just, as long as things don't go too hot or cold, then they can sort of keep it at a manageable level. And I think, there's a certain logic to that. I think the problem with it is over time, China continues to consolidate its control of its entire, 9-dash line claim, or now we're calling it the 10-dash line because they've found another one. So, and that will include the exclusive economic zones of those countries, and it's going to be harder and harder and harder to ignore. And by the time they get around to the point where they want to really start making a fuss, it may be sort of too late. So, so I think that is the real conundrum for these countries.
Right. I want to talk about cooperation among ASEAN countries, including the Philippines, on taking a firm stance against China. We looked at the domestic issues. Now, if we pull back and look at international alliances and perhaps being aligned internationally, how much of an alignment are we seeing?
It's quite a challenge. ASEAN acting in concert, I think, is its greatest challenge at the moment. In some way, China has learned or has been socialized. Instead of ASEAN socializing China, China has been socializing ASEAN on how it should behave rather than be the driving force on the regional security architecture in the region. I think ASEAN has somehow quite kowtow to what China wants. And this is why when countries like the Philippines take a firmer stance, like being more transparent about China's gray zone, it somehow doesn't quite coincide with the strategies of other ASEAN countries that wanted a more diplomatic, laden approach. But one thing that I can say is that the Philippines, I think, among all ASEAN countries, has basically tried the entire range of options with China. We already took China to court on one end, and we've had a very pro-Beijing government 6 years ago, or at least since 2016. And throughout this range, China's behavior towards the Philippines has not changed. It continues to be very aggressive in the South China Sea. It continues to somehow apply these gray zone tactics. So I think as far as certain countries in ASEAN, I think the main principle that could unite them is just to think that we should conduct our foreign policy without thinking about how China will react. Because if it becomes the foreign policy of ASEAN countries, then it will never agree on anything vis-a-vis China.
Right. And so in terms of support, the Philippines has also moved closer to the U.S., allowing the U.S. to have unprecedented number of bases there, or access to bases there. How much does that have to do with China and basically not having that support, regional support? Yes.
Let's remember, the Philippines is the only Southeast Asian country that has a mutual defense treaty with the United States. So therefore, our ability to be really able to stand at the center, which is quite challenging right now for a lot of Southeast Asian countries, is already quite difficult because of that mutual defense treaty, not to mention the colonial past, as well as the very thick relationship between the Philippines and the United States over the decade or even century. In a way, this renewed or revitalization of the relationship between the United States and the Philippines that did not exist before under Duterte, a lot of the analysts are saying that China is to blame here, because if China could have been a little less aggressive and doesn't think the Philippines like its vassal state and really pays respect to its neighbors in accordance with international law, then countries in Southeast Asia will not have to rely on external or other major powers in order to improve its national security. So the regional flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific are numerous. And while the propagandists of Beijing are going to blame the US as well as external powers for it, I think they're pointing the finger, their finger to the wrong actor, and they should point it towards themselves.
Yeah, and speaking of propaganda, what do you think Taiwan can learn from the Philippines' experience with pertaining to tactics that involve disinformation and political infiltration?
I think there are some lessons, and one lesson is that this gray zone tactics will be relentless, and China, as we know, is playing the long game. And in terms of combating or at least addressing these gray zone tactics, it needs to be not just a whole of government approach, but a whole of society approach, meaning this is the time where I think the nation should stand united. And Taiwan actually will continue to also receive or a recipient of this gray zone tactics. But I think one critical thing that could be done between countries like the Philippines and Taiwan is to share lived experiences with China's gray zone tactics. And by this cross-learning of experiences, then we could even think about not just individual responses to this, but even collective responses to China's gray zone strategies.
And on that note, we wrap up this conversation. Aries, it's been such an interesting discussion. A huge thank you to you, Aries Arugay, professor at University of the Philippines-Diliman, speaking to us from Manila. Thank you. And as always, thank you to our viewers. It's been good to have your company. Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.